The exact origins of the world's religions are often shrouded in mystery and the subject of heated debate among academics. Sacred books and religious texts have historical value that has long been an academic battleground for historians for centuries. Islam, as the newest global religion, is considered an exception to this rule. In the 19th century, a French scholar named Ernest Renan claimed that Islam was born in the light of history. For centuries, the prevailing assumption was that the Qur'an, Hadith, Sira, and other Islamic religious texts reflected the historical reality of the religion's founding and development. However, in the 1970s, a movement led by American historian John Wansbrough began to question the historicity of Islamic religious texts. This movement became known as the revisionist school of Islamic studies. This movement questioned aspects that had long been generally accepted, from the origins of Islam to the historicity of the Prophet Muhammad. In this video, we will explore alternative theories about the beginnings of Islam. We have discussed the history and origins of Islam extensively in previous videos, particularly from what is now called the traditionalist perspective. However, in order to contextualize the theories we will discuss today, we must first review the traditional historiography of Islam. According to Islamic holy texts, Islam was founded by its prophet, Muhammad, a man from the Quraysh clan of Arabia. Islamic tradition holds that Muhammad received his first divine revelation at the age of 40 and began to spread the belief in the one God in the pagan city of Mecca. He was persecuted for his teachings and was forced to migrate with his followers to Medina. There, Muhammad managed to establish a Muslim community known as the Ummah and eventually returned to Mecca. Muhammad died in 632, and soon after his death, his successors standardized the Qur'an as we know it today. Muhammad was succeeded by the Rashidun Caliphate, the 4 successive caliphs chosen by the Muslim Ummah to lead the Muslim world. However, the legitimacy of this succession was challenged by Shia Muslims. In this period, the Muslim Caliphate significantly expanded its territory, an expansion which reached its apex during the Umayyad dynasty. The Umayyad dynasty brought an end to the Rashidun Caliphate when Muawiyah, the first Umayyad caliph, transferred power to his son, essentially turning the caliphate into a monarchy. According to the traditionalist view, Islam had become a fully formed religion during the Prophet's lifetime and immediately after his death. According to Robert Hoyland, all the fundamental teachings of Islam had been established before Muhammad's death, and the sources tend to give the impression that Muhammad and his companions brought Islam complete, while subsequent scholars merely codified and interpreted it. As a result, the Qur'an, the Sira, biography of Muhammad, and other interpretations of the religion, such as the Hadith and the writings of later Muslim scholars, such as Al-Tabari, became the primary sources for understanding. The problem is, for a long time, this narrative was widely accepted in academic circles. However, in the 1970s, some scholars began to question the historicity of the Islamic scriptures, and thus gave birth to the revisionist school in Islamic studies. Although the views of revisionist scholars sometimes contradict each other, they agree that the Qur'an, the Sira, and the Hadith should be viewed not as historical sources, but as literary sources. As John Wansbrough puts it, these books are part of the indeed revisionists believe that these Islamic texts, which were codified sometime after the life and death of the Prophet Muhammad, were heavily affected by the political reality and power dynamics of their respective periods. So, what are the most commonly noted problems referred to by revisionist historians in Islamic sources? The main point of contention brought up by revisionists is the 150-year time gap between Muhammad's death and the first Islamic written sources about his life and the emergence of Islam. Indeed, there are no surviving written sources from before the second half of the 8th century describing the events that led to the foundation of Islam in detail. While external sources from the 7th century do mention the emergence of a new religion and a prophet, they do so only superficially. Another issue often pointed out by revisionists is the contradiction between Muslim accounts of the history of Islam and Muhammad's biographies. The same events or stories are described inconsistently. For instance, a prominent revisionist, Patricia Crone, notes that Muslim sources present the same purported encounter of Muhammad with non-Muslims in 15 different ways. Another example is the story of Muhammad's soul being cleansed. The common theme here is that the Prophet's belly was opened by some beings who cleansed his soul from evil. The details of this story differ wildly between different Muslim sources, varying from the nature of the beings who did this, ranging from angels to eagles, the number of people or beings involved, and the number of witnesses to this event. To be fair, it is rather strange that revisionist historians even analyze this story in the context of inconsistent reports, since it is clearly an example of hagiography and religious passage. Many would argue that this story is meant to be taken allegorically, not literally. So, from a historical and academic point of view, it does not really matter that there are inconsistencies in this religious story. The third common problem that revisionists refer to is the impact of political power and dominant narratives on the early Muslim historians of Islam. This argument refutes the notion that the knowledge about Muhammad and the origins of Islam has been preserved. Revisionist historians mention the difference in the description of the jizya ta. The jizya is mentioned in Muslim sources as the tax that non-Muslim peoples of the book must pay to their Muslim rulers. However, in the earlier constitution of Medina, a treaty between Muhammad and the elite of the city of Medina, including the Jewish community, there is no mention of the jizya. Moreover, the criteria for who within the caliphate had to pay the jizya perio. Initially, all converts to Islam were exempt from paying the jizya tax. However, as the number of converts increased, the state began receiving less tax revenue, which was obviously not an ideal situation. Hence, the caliphate gradually started to sophisticate and complicate its taxation system in order to keep the state revenues flowing. Another revisionist historian, Jørgen Simonsen, mentions another example in his work. According to him, the term zakat, which is now associated with the obligation of Muslims to give to charity, originally meant purification in the Qur'an. This means the term was later reinterpreted in Muslim sources to legitimize the transfer of some social burden from the state to the ummah. It is beyond doubt that Islam's holy scripture and other religious texts have been interpreted and reinterpreted on many occasions, and this continues to this day. Muslim rulers, including the caliphs, have used religious authorities to reinterpret the verses of the Qur'an and Hadiths. Some Hadiths are universally rejected in the Islamic tradition for being fabricated for political purposes. However, it is not entirely clear how this argument of the revisionists poses problems to the traditionalist reading of Islamic history. The Qur'an is, first and foremost, a religious book, not a history book or a legal text. Many laws of Islamic states have indeed taken their legitimacy from the Qur'an and Islam's other religious texts, eventually leading to the emergence of Islamic law, the Sharia. With that said, the reinterpretation of Islam's religious texts in different, and at times contradictory, manners does not explicitly refute the traditional understanding of the history of Islam. Revisionist historians pose several other arguments in their critique of the traditionalist point of view. But what is their alternative reading of the history of Islam's emergence? Bear in mind that different historians propose different alternative understandings, and they are often not in agreement among themselves. While Muslims and traditionalist historians believe that the Arabian cities of Mecca and Medina were the places of origin of Islam, the aforementioned skeptics present a different methodology, relying on available foreign historical and linguistic data, along with archaeological evidence. The revisionists refuse to base their scholarship solely on Arabic sources and those that make up the Islamic tradition, believing that non-Muslim sources, which were written about Islam during the time of the religion's founding, provide a better understanding of the early history of Islam. In their work, the Hagarism, Crone and Cook argue that Islam originated as a Jewish messianic movement of Arab warriors and Palestinian Jews led by Muhammad. The Doctrina Jacobi talks about a false prophet appearing among the Saracens, with sword and chariot. This source tells the story of a Byzantine commander being killed by the Saracens and how Jews were overjoyed by this. Assuming this prophet was probably Muhammad, the Greek writer referred to his movement as the Hagarines, descendants of Hagar, Abraham's wife, and Magaritai, or emigrants, a term strikingly similar to the Arabic term Muhajirun, which referred to the earliest Muslim community who emigrated from Mecca to Medina under the leadership of Muhammad. Crone and Cook argue that, after a successful conquest of Palestine under the command of Muhammad, the Arabs gradually broke their alliance with the Jews in fear of being assimilated by them. Instead, they borrowed heavily from Christianity and Judaism to forge a separate religious identity for themselves, Islam. They designated Muhammad as a figure similar to Moses, paving the way to creating their own version of an Abrahamic religion. The authors claim that Islam gained its current form under the Umayyad dynasty, when Arab control over the Holy Land was solidified and entrenched. Thus, Islam did not originate in Arabia, but in the Levant, several generations after the Prophet Muhammad's death. This theory is problematic for several reasons. First, it completely ignores Arab sources and relies on foreign sources, disregarding the fact that non-Arab sources about Islam can be just as biased as Arab sources. Second, even though the Doctrina Jacobi mentions a false prophet, it does not specifically name Muhammad. The traditionalist approach argues that the Islamic conquest of the Levant took place under the first caliph, Abu Bakr, and the military command of Khalid ibn al-Walid. So it is possible that contemporary Christian sources simply confused the commander of the army coming from Arabia with the prophet of a religion coming from Arabia. Third, Jews being happy about the killing of a Byzantine commander does not prove that early Muslims and Jews were allies. Perhaps this Byzantine commander was a common enemy. Perhaps, like many other Christian commanders in history, he oppressed Jews, and they were pleased to see him killed by another group, which was unrelated to them. It is difficult to be sure, but it is clear that this narrative is based on meager and incomplete evidence. Even John Wansbrough, the founder of the revisionist school, criticizes this work based on the selective use of hostile sources. Two other revisionist historians, Yehuda Nevo and Judith Koren, came to a similar conclusion about the geography of the emergence of Islam based on archaeological evidence and non-Muslim sources. They argue that when the Arabs conquered the Levant, they were still pagans and became monotheistic after solidifying their rule there and coming into contact with the Christians and Jews who lived in the region. Only during the reign of Muawiyah did the Arab people solidify their control over the Levant, and only during the reign of Abd al-Malik did Islam, as we know it, emerge. They even go further to add that the proper name Muhammad did not represent a real person, but an adjective, the praised one. This whole argument is based upon several inscriptions found around the River Jordan and the lack of evidence in contemporary Christian sources about the important figures of Islamic history, like the Rashidun caliphs or early Islamic era battles. Other scholars have refuted this ultra-revisionist position and dismissed it as a conspiracy theory, noting that traces of monuments and battlegrounds from the period of the emergence of Islam can, in fact, be seen in and around Mecca and throughout the Arabian Peninsula. Let us give you several relevant examples. There is an inscription from Wadi Qushayba, dated to 650 CE, which begins with "May Allah have mercy," suggesting that the Arabs who wrote it were not in fact still pagan at the time. Another inscription from the year 644 or 645 was found in Ka al-Mutadil saying, "In the name of Allah, I, Zuhair, wrote this at the time when Umar died, in the year 24. These inscriptions explicitly point to the deity the Arabs believed in, Allah, along with the second caliph, Umar. Furthermore, historians like Robert Hoyland and Fred Donner point out that there are contemporary Christian sources from the 7th century discussing the early Rashidun caliphs. Not only that, but there are also Chinese sources talking about them as well. All of this easily refutes Nevo's and Koren's theories. Ultimately, this theory relies on several small pieces of evidence to construct a dubious story of the emergence of Islam, while ignoring plenty of contrary evidence that conflicts with its narrative. Another radical theory about the emergence of Islam outside of Arabia is proposed by the Inara school. They argue that Islam was actually founded by the Nestorian Christians, who seceded from the church after rejecting the First Council of Ephesus in 431. Some of them were Arab Christians, and at one point in the 7th century, they ousted the Byzantine military from the Levant. According to the Inara school, at some point, and for reasons not precisely specified by the authors, these Nestorian Arab Christians decided to give up their Christian identity and create another Abrahamic religion. which by the end of the 7th century evolved into Islam. Similar to Nevo and Qur'an, the Inara school proponents doubted the historicity of the Prophet of Islam. They argued that Muhammad was not his own person, but a title meaning the Praised One, which was just another name for Jesus. This assertion is largely based on a coin from 660 with the word Muhammad, which contains a sign of a cross on it. Similar arguments used for the previous theory can be applied to refute this radical revisionist theory as well. It is just another case of using disconnected evidence and ignoring the wealth of other evidence on the way to constructing a very elaborate theory. The next revisionist theory we are going to discuss has been supported by historians like Moshe Sharon and Fred Donner. Both suggest that Islam did not emerge solely in Arabia. Instead, it was a collection of scattered and initially unconnected groups of believers in a single God. According to Sharon, after the death of Muhammad, different groups of believers emerged throughout the Middle East, including Eastern and Northern Arabia, Iraq and Syria. Each group had its own leader, the Amir al-Mu'minun, or the commander of the believers, a common reference to the caliphs. This theory asserts that the group in Syria was led by the Umayyad family. In Kufa, Ali ibn Abu Talib was the leader, while in the Mecca-Medina region, Abd Allah ibn Zubair was the commander of the believers. These groups competed and fought for power. Ultimately, the Umayyad dynasty won this power struggle and established Islam as the religion of their state to forge a unique religious identity. The proponents of this theory argue that at the initial stages, this movement of monotheistic believers, or mu'minun, did not have a distinct identity and prayed together with Christians. Donner believes that the fact that the word Muslim and its derivatives appear only 75 times in the Qur'an, while the word mu'min, meaning believer, occurs nearly 1,000 times. This, he argues, demonstrates that at the time when the Qur'an emerged, this new religious movement identified themselves not as Muslims, but as believers. Donner claims that Quranic passages sympathetic to Christians and Jews and historical reports of joint prayers demonstrate this.